flip side of that is if you look at, say, other mammals, let's take the rodents, mice and rabbits, every time they copulate, chance of pregnancy is almost 90%. Heather, 90%, right? And so as humans,
Oh, I see. So that's where having sex like rabbits comes from, that term?
exactly.
I'm Heather Grish, and this is the Wisdom of the Body podcast. This podcast explores the idea of body intelligence as the real key to learning the knowledge of life, or what we call Ayurveda in the ancient language of Sanskrit. We do that by connecting with today's creative leaders and experts who will help you listen to your body, trust your gut, and live in deeper harmony with nature. Come join me as we unlock the golden door to clear, direct perception and become very deep listeners. You can find the Wisdom of the Body podcast on Apple, Spotify, and Stitcher. You can also follow us by joining my email at heathergrish.com or on Instagram at heathergrish. I know you're going to love this podcast, so take a second right now to subscribe. So this is part 2 of an interview I did on fertility with Dr. Cindy Duke, where we talk about fertility and the state of reproductive health. And since this is the second part of the episode, you may want to know we covered PCOS a little bit briefly in the first episode. We covered what is the state of reproductive health today with overpopulation and birth rates and fertility on the decline. So we addressed that in the first episode. We also talked a little bit about different kinds of medicine, conventional versus functional medicine approaches to fertility and COVID and things like that. We talked definitely about a little COVID stuff in the first episode. And the second episode that you're going to hear today, it starts talking about the male impacts from COVID. And we talk so much about fertility for females and women or people with uteruses and ovaries. And we really don't talk enough about what's going on with the men. So we're going to talk about that today and the factors in general that influence fertility. Now we're going to talk about, toxins and aging and what's been happening with sperm quantity declines in the last 40 years. And so you're going to get a lot out of this episode. And if you like, you can go back and listen to the first one with Dr. Cindy Duke on episode 63 if you like, or you can start with this one and go back to it. I think either way, it's fine. And you'll enjoy both of them. She's a great speaker and really fun to have on an interview. So I hope you enjoy. Kick back and get your favorite tea or get ready to go out on your walk or cook dinner, whatever you do, and you listen to this podcast on your earphones and enjoy.
I want to emphasize the testicular function because, again, a lot of the conversations centering around periods and fertility are really honing in on female fertility, so to speak, but not really the fertility of people with testicles. And so what we know is following COVID-19 infection, we do see drops in sperm counts. We do see increased rates of erectile dysfunction. And really, if somebody can't achieve an erection, their chances of being able to actively ejaculate goes down. So now suddenly you may go from someone who can conceive without assistance to needing assistance to achieve conception if you're someone with testicles. In fact, the data looking at sperm production following vaccination, you actually see a peak in sperm production in the weeks following vaccination. So I think it's important that we really tease that apart. We see a lot of active misinformation known as disinformation, meaning people purposely putting out information that they know to not be true to influence people against considering vaccination and also to hopefully get those people to promote and proliferate more, propagate more of the misinformation. But for example, that so-called, former Pfizer person comes out, says that vaccines are going to cause miscarriage. Absolutely untrue. The so-called scientific basis of, it resembles a protein, spike protein resembling a protein on the placenta is untrue. So when people think of proteins are actually not linear. They're three-dimensional structures. Spike protein and antibodies generated against a spike protein do not resemble the three-dimensional structure of the protein known as syncytotrophin that's on the placenta. They do not. They're absolutely different, which also means antibodies aren't going to bind one versus the other in the same way, because antibodies are very specific to a three-dimensional shape. And these two things do not share a three-dimensional shape. And so I think that's part of the confusion that was out there, Heather. And of course, sadly, our pandemic has identified another big thing, which is we have a huge gap when it comes to science literacy, health literacy. And if we were to get specific about vaccines, I mean, most of us don't really understand our immune systems, right? Even for those who are clinicians, the time spent on an immunology lecture is very little. You know, you look at the average 4-year medical school curriculum, immunity, the descriptions to cover the whole big thing lasts a short time. You look at nursing school, immunity is covered very, very briefly. You look at even the integrative therapies, the different schools, immunity is a small part of an overall scientific conversation. And so what that means is, if those are the specialists, and then you think of the general population, where the most you learn about is what is an antibody, which is the basics. Usually when you're learning about antibodies, which are from B cells, nobody's really telling you about T cells, which are the things that are really, really, really important for viral infection. And so what we've seen is a constellation of all that coming together to create chaos, right? So we have people using terms like antibodies wantonly when, you know, I would sit and I'm like, well, that doesn't even apply. We're talking viruses here. That particular antibody conversation doesn't apply. Or we see people using antibodies interchangeably to describe how the immune system works, which is completely ignoring all the other aspects of our immune system, or all the hormones known as cytokines and chemokines that the immune system makes. And so, you know, it's really interesting. I think on the other hand, though, we're going to have so much information that we learn in terms of how we interact as a society because of this pandemic. And I don't mean just science information. I think we've learned about the value of communication. We've learned about the value of learning to communicate well. We've learned about the importance of impact versus intent, which is we may mean to say one thing, but what the audience actually hears is different. So learning to look into that and investigate that. We're learning that there are certain communities that are so far back in terms of access to resources that any shift, such as an emergency crisis like a pandemic, can completely disseminate those communities. And we have to ask ourselves, how do we do better? We have to ask ourselves, what is it that we as a society really value? What are our values here? You know, the fact that many of us seem okay with the thought that 700,000 members of our US population have perished in under a year in many ways, because really COVID hit the United States in March of 2020. So by the time we got to March of 2021, we were at the 500,000 mark. How are we okay with that? And what is it that makes it okay? Is it because we've had a continuous exposure for decades of being desensitized to loss? You know, many of us work in places where we don't have access to bereavement leave. Many of us work in places where family just isn't considered of value anymore. And by family, I don't just mean offspring. I mean, what is your familial relationship? Family may mean to you your best friend, you know, yet in many, for example, workplaces, Heather, if your best friend dies, that doesn't qualify you to bereavement time, right? In many places, bereavement literally, it has to be a first degree relative who's passed away, or else you're not entitled to bereavement. And so what that means is we actively have desensitized each other when it comes to the meaning of life and the loss of life and the impact loss has. And so when we now are hearing about people we don't know, we're especially desensitized. But that's my answer to all that.
Well, you brought up some really big things, and, you know, coming back to this idea of values, and it's just sure seems that the inward journey and how we live in relation to the environment around us and the people around
Mhm,
us is so
mhm,
important right now. And, you know, part of that is, what can I do to be better in tune with my health? What can I do to be
mhm,
better in tune with my relationship to my environment. And since you brought up immunity, immunity is one of these things that also affects your fertility
Absolutely.
as well. And I was kind of curious, like, because you've worked with a lot of people in your clinic who are having fertility issues as well. And what do you think some of the factors are that influence fertility now?
Yeah, it's a number of things. So, for those of us who were born with ovaries, the number one factor is still our age. And why do I say age? It's not that you're old and therefore you can't have children, but it's based on the physiology, which is we're born with all the eggs we're going to have. We don't make new ones. And as we age, those egg numbers decline. So, the older we are in terms of chronological age, the less eggs we have to work with. That's the first, just absolute truth. And then the second is as we're aging, those eggs are aging with us. If you imagine that your eggs were formed when you were 20 weeks old in the womb, which is when the fetus forms its ovaries and its eggs, your eggs are technically about 4 months older than you are. And so they're also being exposed to all the things you've been exposed to, speaking of the environment. So if you smoked, not only were you smoking and exposing your lungs, but your eggs were exposed to smoke for whatever that duration of smoking was in your life. If you were eating unhealthy or you were eating a bunch of microplastics and other what we call endocrine disruptors. In fact, the reason why they're called endocrine disruptors is a lot of these inorganic things that our body doesn't know how to break down, they get absorbed and then get sent to the most active parts of your body, which your hormonal glands are some of the most active parts of the body. And so they end up sequestering there, or they end up sequestering at different receptors that interrupt or interfere with how the message happens between those hormones, the messengers, and the organs that need to respond. And so, what we see is a lot of that also will impact the testicles and the eggs, but we're talking specifically about the eggs here, so the ovaries. And so, your environment, what you eat, what you drink, is having that impact on your eggs as well. And so, the more time they've been exposed, not only are you having less eggs from the natural decline of your eggs with age, but you're also having these external factors that can be furthering the decline in number and quality of the eggs. And so I still let everybody know age is a factor. And so while, yes, there are people who get pregnant without any assistance or what we call naturally in their 40s, it is in fact still less likely in terms of probability to have a spontaneous conception in your 40s as it was in your 20s. That's just a fact. But that doesn't mean you're not going to do it. So I don't want people thinking, oh, she's saying you can't do it without assistance in your 40s. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is if you're someone who, as you're aging, is interested in having biological children, you do need to take active steps. So take steps in finding out what is that ovarian reserve? How many eggs do you have remaining? What's your pool of eggs remaining? How is your overall health? And what can you do to improve your health? Which, Heather, I imagine your book, which I'm going to get a copy of, goes into. How can you look at your diet, your activities, your mental health, the sources of your food, the ingredients in your food, the things you cook in, the type of pots and pans, what cosmetics are you using? Because all of these so-called external or environmental things have an impact on your hormones and your egg health and your testicular health as well in terms of sperm. But it's important to know that stuff and recognize that. But other things that you can do, yes, to boost your fertility would be the environmental stuff that I was alluding to there. So we know certain foods are pro-inflammatory, and depending on other underlying health conditions in your body, it may lead to a cascade of events that further accelerates your loss of your eggs or further decreases the function of your sperm. You can have different disease processes that are worsened by the type of chemicals that we absorb into our body. And most people, whenever we talk about chemical exposure in our body, they assume we're talking about just what you eat and drink. But the biggest organ on our body, Heather, is our skin. It's our biggest organ. And our skin absorbs a lot of stuff. So knowing what's in your products, what's in your beauty products, what's in that lotion you love applying, what's in that cleanser that you maybe use 2-3 times a day, it's really important actually, especially if you think of the fact that many of us, from the time you're born, right, your family's moisturizing you, they're putting things on you, you grow up. And for those of us born with ovaries, there's a whole multi-billion-dollar industry just aimed at telling us how to make our skin more beautiful, how to do this, how to do that. But a lot of that stuff disrupts the natural barriers on our skin or our microbiome. It changes the absorption. It changes the ability of your skin to do some of its basic functions, which is just under the skin. There are special cells that make vitamin D, which is actually a hormone. It's a misclassified hormone called a vitamin. But I could keep going on this one, Heather. That's like a whole show in and of itself.
Yeah, and I'm really happy that you keep bringing up the whole bit about male anatomy as well. And it's super important. I know there's been a lot of research that's come out on that recently.
Mm-hmm.
I also think that, because, you mentioned how it's not as likely because of the number of eggs that you're going to have later in life. I happen to be probably an anomaly in that I tried to get pregnant when I was 32 and didn't. And then I got pregnant and had a kid the year I turned 40.
I remember.
Yeah. And it's crazy because that pisses quite a few people off when I say that. But
Oh, why? No.
what really happened in the middle of that, and I can't say that this is the only, because I do think there's something sort of spiritual about the whole fertility thing that we can't quite understand,
Mm-hmm.
because even if we do our darn best to make it happen, it doesn't always work, right? But I did go through quite a health transformation
Mm-hmm.
in that process. And there were other factors. I had a different partner, like so many different things, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it is important that people know that there are things that they could do, but it's very important that they be aware of what's going on in the environment around them now as well, because there are a lot of
Absolutely.
environmental toxins, like you mentioned, and they're very big deals to human health.
They are. And, we're talking about reproduction in particular today and hormones, but these are literally things that are impacting your heart health. They're impacting your kidney function, your liver. Your liver is your big detoxifying organ in your body. And for a lot of us, our livers are under a lot of stress because of all the things we're putting in that it has to detoxify. A lot of our activities have changed over the years. And so a lot of what would have been immune education changes as well, including foods that we're eating and the way they're processed, etc., and modified. And so it is taking charge. And so it doesn't surprise me, Heather, and I shared this before, that you had what turned out to be, quote unquote, an easier time to conceive at 40 versus, say, 32. And of course, it also has to do with the fact that, like we said, 50%, 50% of the time, when you look at a heterosexual couple, or at least a couple where one person has ovaries and the other one has testicles and making sperm, 50% of the time, it involves something going on with the person making sperm. Yet, as a society and culturally, we've put the burden of reproduction on the woman, the person with the ovaries, so that, they're struggling at 32 and everybody's like, well, why can't you get pregnant? You're young and healthy, without ever looking at that person with the sperm. So, yes, that's why I keep interweaving it, because I want that to become part of the normal conversation, right? I want us all, if we are graced with the opportunity to be part of someone's support system, whether as a health professional or as a friend or relative, and we're hearing their discussion about fertility or attempts to conceive, we don't just center the conversation on the person who has the ovaries and the uterus. We need equal attention to the person with the testicles. So, we need the person with the ovaries to have the healthy nutrition, do the good regular exercise, make sure they're looking at what they're heating up their foods in terms of plastics and avoiding the plastic coated nonstick pots. But at the same time, we actually want to do all of that with the person who's making the sperm. We want to look at whether they're smoking. Are they using nicotine? Are they using a lot of other things that are also interfering with not just the amount of sperm being made, but the quality of the sperm being made? We know now that that quality of the sperm, specifically the DNA in the sperm, has lasting impact, including changes with genetics and chromosomes, but also risk of miscarriage, right? And so, there wasn't a lot of focus because a lot of people thought once the pregnancy was achieved, if we talk about pregnancy loss, i.e., miscarriage and stillbirth, the thought was now it all rests on the person who's carrying the pregnancy. But we understand now that first trimester pregnancy loss, there's still a significant amount of that that's determined by sperm quality. And so that's why I interweave it so much, Heather, because I do want to change that narrative. And I do want people to recognize that when we talk about reproduction, while we all still unintentionally carry or place the responsibility and the burden of reproduction and the propagation of the human race to make it sound really massive on those born with uteruses and ovaries, it's actually equally the responsibility biologically as well for those born with testicles and making sperm.
A lot of people know that I got pregnant with my son on the first try and had him the year I turned 40. But a lot of people don't know that I first tried to get pregnant in my early 30s. The journey to motherhood was the most frustrating journey I have ever gone through. And that's what prompted me to write the book, The Ayurvedic Guide to Fertility, about the methods that ultimately helped me through that journey and helped me come out healthier, more aligned with nature, and frankly, more mystified on the other side of it. So if you're really stumped about the things that are within your power to change in your fertility and reproductive health, and you are curious about what you might be able to activate by getting more in touch with your body through the methods I used, then connect with me on Instagram, because there are definitely ways to go through the process in complete surrender. So find me on Instagram at Heather Grish. That's at Heather Grzych. Alleluia. So basically, both for people with the ovaries and the people with the testicles, learning to take care of your own body is so important, because you're also learning to take care of your future kids in that. And
yes,
right?
Indeed.
Because I remember you telling me that you studied with Dr. Shanna Swan. I remember
at University of Rochester. Yes, when I was a med student.
And there is that book that she came out with last year, Countdown, or this year, really highlights, I know she's been talking about this for years, but the data on how much the sperm counts, and you're talking about sperm quality, which is also a factor, but even just the sperm counts have decreased. And I think the estimate is
in the last 40 years,
between like 50 to 59%.
Correct.
It's mind-blowing.
It's mind-blowing. And that is not explained away by genetics. What that really is explained away by, not that explained away is a good term, but the way we explain that is by looking at all of the environmental changes that have been happening over the last 40 years or so, and what impact that then has. And particularly, we're saying Western countries because the studies looked specifically mostly at semen numbers collected across clinics in the Western Hemisphere. But we do see a massive drop in the total number of sperm being made. And to explain this to people, when it comes to male fertility or testicular function sperm-based fertility, you need a couple factors to drive success at starting a pregnancy. And the first is it's a numbers game. You need millions of sperm that are moving well and are shaped well to actually have an opportunity to interact with one egg to affect the chance at a pregnancy, which confuses a lot of people, right? Especially for those of us who we feel like we know someone who seems like anytime their eggs are exposed to sperm, they're pregnant. So it's hard to really recognize and hear that, in fact, as human beings, we have the least efficient form, or one of the least efficient forms of reproduction amongst mammals, for sure. And just to give an example, so for example, you take a young, healthy, let's take on average 25-year-old with ovaries who's ovulating, releasing eggs regularly, having regular unprotected intercourse with someone making sperm, meaning every 2 to 3 days around the time of ovulation. And their chance of having a pregnancy by the end of a year of that regular unprotected intercourse around ovulation, chance of pregnancy is about 22%. 22%. The flip side of that is if you look at, say, other mammals, let's take the rodents, mice and rabbits, every time they copulate, chance of pregnancy is almost 90%. Heather, 90%, right?
Oh, I see. So that's where having sex like rabbits comes from, that term?
Exactly. And it's really because every time they copulate, there's some babies coming. I live here in Vegas, but Vegas has a very, very massive population of rabbits. And so, like, whenever I look outside in our area, we have a lot of cottontail rabbits. Like, a park here is called Cottontail Park because you see them everywhere. And that's part of it, is they reproduce, and they reproduce fast. The same for mice and hamsters, etc. And so it's very different for human beings. And in fact, we need millions of sperm to go up there. And so the first thing is, the reason why we now know that male fertility is impacted also has to do with those counts have dropped, because it means we have about half as many sperm heading up to interact with eggs compared to 40, 50 years ago. You couple that with people also, in terms of those actively trying to conceive, they're generally doing that at an older age. Why do I say actively trying to conceive? The reality is that in the United States specifically, 50% of pregnancies are still unintended, meaning it was sort of oh, I'm pregnant, right? And so when we talk about those who are struggling with infertility, they're really in the category of actively having tried, etc., many of them for quite a while. And, in so much as our definitions say, if you're under 35 and you have ovaries, if you've been having regular unprotected intercourse or doing inseminations for a year and haven't conceived, that's infertility. If you're 35 and older, 6 months and you haven't conceived, that's infertility. But the truth is, Heather, most of the people who come to me, they're people who actively were having unprotected intercourse for 9 years, 7 years, 3 years, and haven't conceived. And so, in so much as we have these tight definitions and we're actively out there telling people about it, most people still don't show up for evaluation until much later.
That is such a frustrating process for anybody to have to go through, with so many emotions. And, the point that you brought up about I'm going to kind of put a joke in here. It's probably going to be a really bad joke, but like, since the male sperm counts have gone down so much, shouldn't we just be like giving people more COVID vaccines? Because didn't you say that there's research that shows that there's a bump? No, I'm just kidding.
There's a bump. Yeah, no. We're definitely not going to offer vaccines to boost male fertility, but we do point out that if you got it, it wouldn't hurt things. And in fact, to that point though, Heather, we're hearing a lot of people who are having those oopsies, and I think it's multifold. One is a lot more people have more interactions with other humans now that vaccines and so forth are out. So yeah, we're starting to hear of more pregnancies. Sadly, we're also hearing about more sexually transmitted infections. In fact, the US now has its highest rate of STIs in the history of tracking them. And we think it's because a lot of people are back out there and back in the saddle, so to speak.
Oh my goodness, like, I got my vaccine, I'm protected, nothing can harm me now.
Yes.
Crazy, buck wild.
It's the vax, waxed, and ready to relax mentality, and it's interesting because if you look at the dating sites, I do a lot of research on tech and closing disparities. So one of the recent projects we've been doing is one of the well-known dating apps. And it's interesting how many people actively have on their profile vaxxed, right? That is part of their calling card, so to speak. I'm vaxxed. But of course, what isn't on the calling card is whether they've had their gonorrhea,
Right.
HIV, etc. done. And so we've started working with this particular app to say, hey, hey, how do we come up with something where people can actually get some education on that? We're not saying share your status, but we definitely think people need to be aware because, again, we have the highest rates of STIs in this country, higher than even the rates that we're seeing, get this, Heather, after the flu of 1918. So it turns out that we're seeing a bump similar to what they saw in terms of a bump following the flu of 1918, where there were also a lot of restrictions and people needing to wear masks and stay at home and so on. There was a big bump in sexually transmitted infections, which also tells you human behavior doesn't change, right? A century later, and the moment people were able to get back out there, they were out there doing it.
Wow. So this is when the baby boom begins.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Oh my gosh, we have covered so much and I'm having so much fun talking with you. And I'm going to ask you the final question, which is something I ask all my guests. I love to hear everybody's different responses to it. And it is, what does the wisdom of the body mean to you?
I love that. What does the wisdom of the body means to me? You know, one of the things I like to tell people is our body knows what it wants long before we acknowledge it. And so the wisdom of the body is taking time to be in tune with your body, you know. And of course, because I'm a hormone specialist, I spend time talking to patients about how they interpret things like cravings, things like suddenly you're craving inert things like metals, etc. And in fact, that's really your brain telling you, hey, we're low on iron or we're low on magnesium. It's interesting how the body is wise enough to recognize what it's missing and create a signal that translates into a knowing what it needs and a messaging to you that you then seek out the thing without knowing exactly what it is if you're not in tune. And that to me is really incredibly dynamic. It's nothing that can be explained with just saying it's this test or that test. It suggests a series of deep, deep conversations and communications that are happening at this sort of, I guess, the soul level, the realm that we haven't fully tapped into properly yet as humans. So that's what I think about the wisdom of the body. It's first acknowledging that your body usually knows what it wants and it's usually giving you cues as to how you can help yourself. And we have to learn how to reprogram the recognition because sadly a lot of active marketing campaigns and a lot of other things have taught us to ignore those cues over the years because people needed to sell us certain foods or they needed to sell us certain cosmetics or they needed to sell us certain electronics. And so the first thing they needed to do was deprogram your ability to listen to the cues. But the body is really wise. It always usually knows what it needs. If your body's telling you don't work so hard right now, trust and believe it knows why. If it's telling you this isn't the time to do that strenuous exercise, it's because it knows why. It's probably determined that even the heart needs a little bit more boosting before you do that thing. But many of us aren't in touch with the cues anymore. So that's what it means for me, Heather.
Oh my God, I love you. It's been so wonderful having you here on the Wisdom of the Body today. And I'm sure the audience is going to love this episode. And I really enjoyed being here with you. And I can't wait till we speak again.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This was an honor, and I can't wait to hear the episode myself, and I'll be sure to amplify and share it across all my social media.
Amazing. And actually, if you would tell them where to check out your work, your social media, on everything that you've been sharing.
Oh, yes. So I'm across social media. I have the same handle everywhere, which is Dr. Cindy M. Duke. So at DRCINDY, M as in Mary Duke, Dr. Cindy M. Duke. And my website is drcindyduke.com. And so on my website, you can usually find out all the things I'm doing, the things I'm passionate with. I started something called the Directory of Black Women Physicians. So if someone's actively seeking out a Black woman physician, whether it be as a patient or maybe you're a member of the media and you're thinking, well, I can't ever find them anywhere. there. I've been actively keeping a list of them and having them update their information. At this point, we have almost 200 on the list who are from various specialties across the United States to help people identify them. We also have My Dynamic Uterus on Clubhouse, which is the largest reproductive health, pregnancy, and fertility focused club on the app. And we do a number of different rooms talking about periods, PCOS, fertility, infertility, mental health as it relates to fertility, reproduction, menopause, and so much more. So I encourage you, I'm always eager to interact on social media. Feel free to reach out. If you heard me on the podcast, let me know so I can one, tell Heather, but also so that we can have something to commiserate about.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you for tuning in and dropping in with us today. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. I really want to hear your feedback. To learn more about my work, visit heathergrish.com. That's Heather, GRZYCH.com. And meet me here next time on The Wisdom of the Body.